Good evening, and welcome to Skep Talk, the monthly speaker series hosted by the Bay Area Skeptics. Before tonight's presentation, a few words about Bay Area Skeptics. As North America's oldest skeptical organization, we are dedicated to promoting critical thinking, logic, and rational thought. In the 1970s and 80s, scientists such as Carl Sagan and magicians such as James Randi established the scientific skepticism movement out of concern about the popular fondness for pseudoscience and the lack of public science literacy. Scientific skepticism embraces evidence-based civil discourse on health, education, consumer protection, and especially the investigation of extraordinary claims. Using the scientific method, we hope to promote skeptical inquiry to reduce irrational thinking in society. This talk is supported by Bay Area Skeptics members such as you. Please visit us at baskeptics.org or join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Meetup. Consider supporting us through convenient monthly donations via Patreon. Patrons receive premiums such as discounts and free t-shirts for our annual Skeptical Conference. But more importantly, members help us make the world just a little more reasonable and rational. And now, tonight's speaker.
Good evening. I'm Eugenie Scott. I'm a board member of Bay Area Skeptics. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Nick Motzke, who is kind of a local boy, I guess, since he got his PhD in integrative biology at UC Berkeley in 2013. Currently, he's at the School of Biological Sciences at the University of Auckland. He's a computational biologist modeling evolutionary biogeography and phylogeny. Now, there's a lot in that sentence. Perhaps it might be courteous to some listeners who are not as familiar with those topics to unpack it a little bit. Basically, he uses mathematical modeling and computational simulations to show evolutionary relationships, that's the phylogeny part, among species and lineages, but living as well as fossil, emphasizing their geographical as well as temporal relationships. Currently, he's working on biogeographical dispersal and paleoclimate change models. So Nick's professional work is pretty cool. And as much as I would love to have him talk about biogeographical modeling, I've asked him tonight to talk about another interest of his, the creationist movement called intelligent design. Now, some of you know that before I retired, I was director of the National Center for Science Education, which monitors efforts to compromise the teaching of evolution and climate change. 20 years ago, we were keeping our eyes on Dover, Pennsylvania, which is a small community in the central part of the state. Over the summer, there had been a lot of back and forth in the school board meetings over new biology textbooks and the teaching of evolution, and it was quite contentious. School board members held the new textbooks hostage to encourage the teachers to include material on intelligent design. Now, at NCSE, when we get flare-ups like this, we assign a staff member to monitor the situation, work with the community members, try to resolve the issue. Generally, we make every effort to resolve these kinds of issues backstage, behind the scenes. And Nick got this particular straw of Dover because even before working at NCSE, he had spent a lot of time analyzing intelligent design arguments and had even done some modeling on how to explain the evolution of the bacterial flagellum, which is something of a poster child for intelligent design. Now, things went south in Dover, and it wasn't Nick's fault. It wasn't his fault that Dover turned out to be a 5-alarm fire, and culminating in a trial in federal district court that literally gained international coverage. And I think there have been 5, maybe 6 books written about the trial, and reporters from literally all over the world showed up in the courthouse in Pennsylvania. NCSE ended up advising the legal team for the plaintiffs for what became Kitzmiller versus Dover. And Nick spent the better part of the year focusing on just this flare-up. Now, Nick will tell you more about how events unfolded, and it's a really good story. But I assure you, local citizens and NCSE worked very hard to avoid going to court. As it happens, the Board of Trustees was unwilling to compromise on anything, and citizens of Dover had no other recourse than to sue or let bad science be taught. And that they would not do. And NCSE was very happy to help make sure that that didn't happen. In a post-trial interview in the journal Science, Nick summed up some of his feelings, quote, "It was very gratifying to have my very obscure hobby turn into a key skill in an internationally recognized court case. It was kind of like the movie Galaxy Quest, where the Trekkie nerd gets told that the spaceship and aliens from the Star Trek-esque TV show are all real, and his nerdy knowledge saves the day. Please welcome my friend and former colleague, distinguished scientist and fellow creationism and evolution nerd, Dr. Nick Matzke, easy for me to say, Dr. Nick Matzke, speaking tonight on the biology class you wish you could have taken, Kitzmiller versus Dover, 20 years later. Nick, welcome to Bay Area Skeptics.
Thank you so much. I had forgotten about that quote, but that's still, that brings it all back. That really was
such a great quote.
I know it was, but it was, it was like that. Because it's for me personally, this started as a hobby. Like, some people follow the creation evolution issue, and I did. I had family history, with sort of both sides in it, right? And so I developed an interest, and then, as the intelligent design movement got notoriety and got, some evidence that it was getting some traction, as you recall, in the early 2000s, right? More and more obsessed with it, and then, made some connections at NCSE and did some writing, and then somehow or other got hired, which was an amazing in my life. Early 2004, getting hired because I was, working in a direction in a master's degree in geography, which didn't really turn out to be my passion, and then suddenly I got to go 110% into what really turned out to be my passion, and it really has affected my whole life since then. So I should thank Jeannie for that and for that opportunity, and everyone who worked on the Kitzmiller case and at NCSE, because I think it was a key moment in that issue, which I think will reverberate, for a long, long time, even past now 20 years later. So.
Yes, I'm sure there will be comments from the people watching this and questions. It is one small community in the middle of Pennsylvania 20 years ago, who cares kind of thing. But the issues that are raised by that trial and the whole relationship between science and society and education as well, what do we teach and why do we teach it the way we do and what do we choose to teach? Those are all factors that reverberate until the present. But as much as I would love to keep talking to you, I had better not, or I will take up everybody's time and they will not be able to hear you. So Nick, take it away.
Cool. Thanks very much. So I think I just have to hit slideshow, play from start. Does that look okay? You can see that, I believe. I'm just going to make sure. Yeah, looks like we can see it. So I will hit play. Cool. All right. I'm going to assume this is working. So my talk is titled The Biology Class You Wish You Could Have Taken, Kitzmiller versus Dover, 20 years later. And that quote comes from this article in The New Yorker, which was published just after the trial in 2005. And that cartoon is kind of emblematic of the weirdness of this case. So this was a federal court trial in Dover, Pennsylvania, south central Pennsylvania, right near the Gettysburg, the Battle of Gettysburg battlefield. And what you see there is you see Michael Behe on the witness stand. He was the leading intelligent design advocate, being examined by Eric Rothschild, one of the lead plaintiff's attorneys on the side challenging intelligent design. And you see some of the issues being discussed there, including whale evolution. You see sort of an early whale ancestor in a whale, and you see a bacterial flagellum there. And you see the judge in the background, right, with a puzzled look on his face. This was one of the bizarre and amazing features of this case, is we had 6 weeks in a trial to try and present the case for why teaching evolution was teaching good modern science, why evolution wasn't a theory in crisis, and why this idea of intelligent design was not teaching good science, instead it was teaching religion. So I'll take you through some of the key issues that came up in that case. And then at the end, I want to update you on some of the work that I've participated in since then, advancing some of the scholarship on some of these issues. And if people are familiar with this case, you may have heard this first part before, but it's nice to have a refresher since it has been 20 years. I can't believe it. The Scopes monkey trial was 100 years ago this year in 1925, and now we're 20 years from the Kitzmiller trial. So it's interesting to look back. We are doing a reunion in Tennessee at one of the conferences on the Scopes monkey trial in July, and so people should pay attention for Scopes monkey trial events to look for what's coming up on this issue. I think it has some salience here in 2025, science and politics. Seems relevant. But to take you back to 2005, this was a map published in Time magazine back then, indicating all of the controversies that were happening over evolution education in 2005. And this was, you may recall, George W. Bush was in office. There was a feeling then that the Supreme Court was getting more conservative. It turned out to be maybe not super true at the time, but of course it's happened much more since then. And these little dots were individual communities that were having battles. These red areas are areas that were having statewide fights, state board of education or state legislature battles over teaching evolution. And Dover, Pennsylvania was just one of these. So when I was working at the National Center for Science Education, we had these things called flare-ups, which are these particular battles about education policy, science curricula, et cetera. And Dover initially was just one of these. But it was one where the school board, there was a kind of a conservative school board had been elected, and they were really feeling it. They were feeling that this was their moment to take the evolution issue to the courts and to maybe go all the way to the Supreme Court and get intelligent design okayed as being okay for science education. Just to give you a sense of what was in the media, right? Here's the Time magazine cover story. Here was the journal Nature, right, from the same time period. They had a fake disclaimer on their cover because some school districts were trying to put sort of cigarette warning labels on biology textbooks because they mentioned evolution. So this says, the journal contains material on evolution. Evolution is a theory, not a fact. It should be approached with an open mind, critically considered, right? This was the kind of thing going on. There's Science magazine covering it with a similar map. With creationist activity. Newsweek, back when Newsweek was a thing, right? It was covering it. It covered the intelligent design movement. Even magazines like Esquire, right? Covers like the sexiest woman alive, but they had this other story, creationists and other idiots, and then even National Geographic, right? Has this cover, was Darwin wrong? A lot of us looked at this in the newsstands and were like, wait, what's going on? But if you opened to the article, you saw what they said, right? Even Scientific American got into it. This was their April 1st, 2005 issue. This wasn't the actual cover, but this was a fake cover that they put inside. Is the Earth flat? A balanced debate. The myth of the atom. Your next car will run on cold fusion, right? So a lot of people were paying attention to this, and I was there working at the National Center for Science Education, along with an amazing team of people led by Eugenie Scott. And this was and is the clearinghouse for dealing with challenges to science education, especially evolution, climate change, are always politically hot button topics. And this goes way, way back in the US, right? This goes back to that Scopes monkey trial in Dayton, Tennessee of 1925, where Clarence Darrow and William Jennings Bryan, who was kind of a populist, I won't say he's Trump-like. I think William Jennings Bryan was several steps above Trump, but he was a populist who decided that evolution was the source of many evils. And he led a campaign to ban the teaching of evolution. And the early version of the ACLU, which had just been founded in the 1920s, challenged this in court with the famous lawyer Clarence Darrow on their team. And the ACLU actually technically lost that case, even though they embarrassed William Jennings Bryan and the creationists. Bryan died a few days after the trial. But bans on teaching evolution remained constitutional. And so the history of evolution and anti-evolution in the U.S., teaching evolution came along with teaching high schools, having high schools and teaching high school biology. These bans on evolution were challenged in 1925, but despite the sort of public embarrassment, the Tennessee ban on teaching evolution remained in effect into the 1960s. In 1968, the Supreme Court, Epperson v. Arkansas, said that banning the teaching of evolution was unconstitutional. And a new strategy pretty instantaneously arose called creation science, or scientific creationism. And there were battles about that through the 1970s. And then in 1981, there was a court case in Arkansas called McLean versus Arkansas, where a bunch of scientists, including Stephen Jay Gould and Francisco Ayala and others, testified about the teaching of evolution and had sort of a courtroom battle with various creationist witnesses. And a very strong decision saying that creation science was unconstitutional happened in 1981. There was a similar case with a Louisiana creation science bill. These bills required equal time for creation science and evolution. Louisiana and Arkansas passed them. The Louisiana bill went all the way to the Supreme Court. And in 1987, the Supreme Court said, no, teaching creation science is a government establishment of a religion, and therefore it's unconstitutional. And of course, the intelligent design movement arose after that and persisted, got more and more attention in the 1990s up until 2005. And this 2005 Kitzmiller Dover case, just to see sort of what happened in the media. Here it's sort of spikes of media attention to this issue. And that 2005 era was the last big spike that we've seen. But you can see these other spikes in the 20s and the 80s. The intelligent design spike really began with this book Of Pandas and People. This is the book. It was a supplemental biology textbook. It's about 100 pages long. It's quite thin. But it has a nice panda on the cover, and it's quite glossy. It had, it was sort of a new level of sophistication for some creationist books. And the term intelligent design, this is the first book in which it appears in a glossary or as sort of an official term. You can randomly see the words associated in other earlier works, but this is the first book that really put together intelligent design as an official term, right? And just to give you an example, the kinds of arguments they make in the book, they say, well, the fossil record, you have different morphology, but it doesn't connect up back in time. And you'll see quotes like this, gaps in the fossil record. Here's one of the famous quotes. Intelligent design means that various forms of life began abruptly through an intelligent agency with their distinctive features already intact, fish with fins and scales, birds with feathers, beaks and wings, etc. So, they're not saying God created things in 6 days. They're not saying God created anything. They're just saying that, various forms of life began abruptly through an intelligent agency, whatever that means. This is Discovery Institute, after Pandas was published in 1989, in the early 90s, maybe 96, the Discovery Institute, which is that group in Seattle, a think tank in Seattle that promotes intelligent design, they started the Center for the Renewal of Science and Culture. And their early banners were fairly explicitly religious here. But they got, here's God creating DNA instead of God creating Adam. Here's another version. Now they have the I Nebula. They eventually became, instead of the Center for the Renewal of Science and Culture, they became the Center for Science and Culture. And, and they're still going today, of course. But they were the big group pushing this after the Pandas book had been published by a different group early on. So they were the big intelligent design promoters. And this all came to a head in 2004 when, you can see October 19th, 2004, the Dover, Pennsylvania School Board voted in intelligent design. And this was a policy that required teachers to read a statement and to make the Pandas book accessible in the biology classroom. And there was quite a lot of pushback against this. The Pennsylvania Teachers Union pushed back. The teachers refused to read this statement. But also we had a response from a legal team. So the ACLU, with the cooperation of the group Americans United for Separation of Church and State, and with lawyers from the law firm Pepper Hamilton, a big Pennsylvania law firm. Here are three of the lawyers on the case. There's Vic Walczak in the middle, Steve Harvey, Vic Walczak from the Pennsylvania ACLU, Steve Harvey on the left, and Eric Rothschild on the right. Assembled a sort of dream team, legal team, science team to challenge this intelligent design policy. And part of the logic was, if we're going to invest the time to do a challenge, we just want to do it right and do it once. We don't want to have to fight this battle a million times. And so working at NCSE, we were sort of contracted to be the advisors to the legal team. And so I got to participate in the preparations for this case. So there I am in the background. I get captured in the background of a few things. There's me in the background of this press scrum here. And even in a courtroom artist drawing, I got stuck in the background here. So here we have Kenneth Miller, current president of the board of NCSE, and author of a leading biology textbook. He testified in the case. There's Judge Jones. There's the lawyers from the other side. And yeah, I got captured in the background, which is maybe something not many people can say. So anyway, we got some good rulings out of this case, and I'll take you through some of the evidence that was presented. We got this ruling that intelligent design is not science. And how did this occur? Well, we spent, days and days. We had Kevin Padian, a paleontologist, and Ken Miller, a biologist, testify, along with some philosophers and even a theologian. And one part of the argument was just to take apart the assertions in this pandas book. And so one of the assertions dealt with convergent evolution. There's this idea that dogs and wolves have similar skulls, but then there's this marsupial wolf, the thylacine from Tasmania, right? And it has a superficially similar skull, and the pandas book kind of says, well, if similarity can happen independently, then similarity isn't evidence for common ancestry. So the whole thing is bunk, is kind of what pandas says. And so Kevin Padian, the paleontologist from UC Berkeley, actually, challenged this, and he sort of presents the argument. Here's these different organisms, and even on a cursory look, right, you can tell that the thylacine is not really the same kind of thing as a dog or a wolf. It is a carnivore. It's got some superficial similarities, but it's a little bit more like a sort of big, mean possum is really what it looks like. Big, mean, long-legged possum. And he even, he and his graduate students went to the UC Berkeley museum collections and pulled out things like wolf skulls and thylacine skulls. Berkeley is an amazing place. They have a thylacine skull, even though the species is extinct. And he did what paleontologists do. He analyzed the anatomy in the court case. And he said, what we can do is we can look at skulls, and we can look at individual features of skulls, look for key characteristics. For example, the North American wolf at the top, placental mammals have 4 premolars and 2 molars. And marsupials have 3 premolars and 4 molars. These are tooth formula. And they're often quite conservative characters that can distinguish different groups of animals. And he went through a whole bunch of these characters, right, in a courtroom. And I'm pretty sure this is the first time that thylacine anatomy has ever been analyzed, right, in a federal court or any court. I'll show you a few more of these slides. Here's the dog and the wolf, and the dog and the wolf, right, both have 4 premolars and 2 molars and a variety of other features. A kangaroo and a Tasmanian wolf, they both share the character of having 4 molars. The kangaroos have lost their premolars. They're herbivorous, right? They're eating grass and stuff, but they share that characteristic of 4 molars. So this was the kind of thing that was presented in a courtroom. And during the case, we had students and professors and teachers come in and watch the proceedings, because, this was, if you wanted a whole day of paleontology, you could get it in this court case. Another kind of argument that the pandas book made was about information in DNA. And so this is a graphic from the book. It says, John loves Mary. And it says, even the briefest message, if meaningful, speaks unmistakably of an intelligent source. And so the argument is basically there's information in the DNA. Information comes from intelligence. Therefore, DNA is basically evidence of intelligent design. John loves Mary seems like a non-random choice of names. Those are the names of the parents of Jesus, of course. But those sort of wink, wink, nod, nod things are found in that text a little bit. How was this rebutted in court? Well, I, in part, got to help assemble material for cross-examination. One of the articles I had dug up was this one. It's called The Origin of New Genes, Glimpses from the Young and the Old, by a leading expert, Manuel Long, at the University of Chicago. And it talks about, well, where does new genetic information come from? And it comes from processes like gene duplication, rearrangement of genes, things like that. And a variety of the mechanisms were described by Ken Miller in the trial. And then a bunch of examples of new genes of relatively recent origins, where the origins are recent enough in genomes that you can sort of reconstruct how they came about. This was presented in court. And the Judge Jones, the judge in this case, who was a Republican judge, right, appointed by George W. Bush, he cited this evidence in rebutting this genetic information argument. Let's see, another claim that was made was this one about scientific literature. So Michael Behe, he had this argument about irreducible complexity. This is the idea that some biochemical systems are so complex, and especially they have multiple interacting parts which are all required for function. How could such a system evolve if a partial system couldn't function? And he had in the world of anti-evolution books, Darwin's Black Box really is the best book. It was better argued than most of them. And he went through a number of systems, including the bacterial flagellum, the eukaryotic cilium, blood clotting, and the immune system, and said that there's not literature on how these things evolved. And this is one of his quotes: we can look high or we can look low in books or in journals, but the result is the same. The scientific literature has no answers to the question of the origin of the immune system. And so what did I do? Well, actually, this was one of these circumstances of history. I happened to have a University of California library card, even though I was not working or a student at the University of California at the time. I had done a master's degree at UC Santa Barbara, and I was an alumnus of the University of California, and so I could get a library card for the UC Berkeley library. And so I went there and spent some time digging up literature from the amazing biosciences library at University at Berkeley on literature on the origin and evolution of the immune system. So here's a book that you can check out from the library called The Origin and Evolution of the Vertebrate Immune System. And I actually checked this book out and carried it and a number of other books all the way to Pennsylvania, specifically so that the lawyers could, if they wanted, use them in the courtroom cross-examination of Michael Behe. And they did, and this is the actual stack from the actual library, right? You can see books on just immunology or evolution of immunology, evolution of immune reactions, phylogenies of immune functions. It turns out evolutionary immunology is quite a big field because comparative biology is part of how they figured out how the immune system works and how it evolved. And so there were, I think 12 or 13 books and 50 some papers that were presented. And this was actually stacked on the witness stand in front of Michael Behe, challenging his statement that there were no articles on the evolution of the immune system, right? And it became known as a little bit of the Miracle on 34th Street cross, because there was that movie Miracle on 34th Street where they're presenting, what are they doing? They're sort of presenting letters from children to Santa Claus as evidence that Santa Claus, is a real person. So honestly, that analogy undermines the argument a little bit, but it was this very theatrical event that really did make an impression, because Behe would not rescind his statement that there was no literature, right? And then the more he stuck to his guns, the more discredited he was. So that was quite an episode. And this was that quote from the New Yorker, this was like the biology class you wished you could have taken. So that was part of how we got this ruling that intelligent design is not science. But there was some other important parts to this case. Just showing that something isn't science isn't enough to get it ruled unconstitutional, right? Teaching students that Bigfoot is real, it's not science, and it would be silly to do it in a science classroom, but there's nothing unconstitutional about teaching Bigfoot in a science classroom. It's just dumb, but it's not a government establishment of religion, right? What the Constitution prohibits is the government establishing a particular religious view. And so we also had to make an argument in the case that this intelligent design thing, it wasn't just bad science, although that's important to rebut their argument that intelligent design is science. We had to argue positively that intelligent design was a religious view. So how was that done? And I also got to participate in this part of the case, doing some research. The National Center for Science Education maintained an amazing archive of the history of the creation science movement and the intelligent design movement. And in 2005, early 2005, while we were prepping for this case, I dug around in the stacks of the National Center for Science Education. And I did not know about any of this before I worked there, but they had things like old student newspapers from the early 1980s, back before the internet. Student groups could get money and make newspapers. And the creationist group, the sort of proto-intelligent design group, had a newspaper, and NCSE had a copy. And I looked through them, and I found this this little ad here. This was right around when the Arkansas lawsuit was happening, right? And they say the lawsuit prospects are dim in Arkansas, but bright in Louisiana. So they could kind of tell they were losing in Arkansas, but they might win in Louisiana. So there's this unbiased biology textbook planned. And it says, this is 1981 or early 82, I believe. It says a high school biology textbook is in the planning stages that will be sensitively written to present both evolution and creation while limiting the discussion to scientific data. And this is Charles Thaxton, who ends up being, I think he's an editor on the Pandas book. And the two authors are actually Dean Kenyon and Percival Davis, who are both known creationists. So that was quite remarkable that there's this mention of the Pandas book before it had the Pandas name, and years before 1989 when the Pandas and People book came out. This was another key thing that occurred. Jessica Moran, who was the archivist at NCSE, and who actually, she now lives in New Zealand, works at the New Zealand National Library, I believe. She pulled this document up, and you can see what this is. This is a fax in 1995, back when there were faxes, right? You had to sort of scan a document and send it through the phone lines. And this is Tom Jukes, who's a quite famous professor at Berkeley, who's now deceased. He was a famous professor in molecular evolution, but he liked to track the creationists. And he says, Eugenie Scott, I found this in an old file, but it is certainly fascinating. And what it is a, I think it was from 1986 or 87, a prospectus for this book, Biology and Origins, which was from this document and from the authors, you can tell this was an early version of the Pandas and People book, because it's got 6 chapters, it's got the right authors, but it wasn't called Pandas and People, it was called Biology and Origins. And this really got us cooking, because this was one of the documents that got me thinking, maybe this wasn't just a project that was being worked on in the 80s. Maybe there were actual physical drafts of this old version of the Pandas and People book. And here's an email that I got permission to put in PowerPoint presentations. I said, I am reasonably sure that the word creation would be substituted for design or intelligence design at many points within that manuscript. If we can find this early version, this would prove our point in many ways. And said, I said, we don't know if there's still copies of this draft. I don't know whether Dembski, who was one of the expert witnesses, has seen them. But I sent this around to the legal team, and they were like, oh, my goodness, well, we should at least check. And they issued a subpoena to the group that had published the Pandas book for any drafts and related materials. And who knows, maybe those things had long been lost. But I had a feeling there had been evidence that copies of this book had been used in schools before the Pandas book had been published. So in 1987, they did a trial run in a school in Texas. So I bet there were a lot of copies, and probably they weren't all gone. So anyway, they did the subpoena, and it turned out there wasn't just one draft that came out of the subpoena. There were about 5. And the first one was called Creation Biology Textbook Supplement from 1983. And so Creation Biology is a rather different title than Pandas and People. A later version was called Biology and Creation, 86. Then Biology and Origins, which we'd had that note about. And then 1987, Pandas and People. And then there was a second draft in 1987. And we'll look at the differences between those drafts in a minute. We'd always said, you can find many people, Michael Roos, Kevin Padian, Rob Pannock, saying that intelligent design was a relabeling of creationism. But it wasn't until we had these drafts that we had that in a extremely literal way, right? So here's that line about intelligent design means that various forms of life begin abruptly, but we can compare these in the drafts. I think Barbara Forrest did this first. She was one of the witnesses. And if you look at the terminology, you can see that the word creation got changed into the word intelligent design between the two 1987 drafts. And similarly, intelligent creator becomes intelligent creator with a capital C, but then gets switched to intelligent agency. And this happened between 2 drafts labeled 1987. And so this fell to me. We had a digital version of these texts from the scanning of all these legal documents, or all these subpoenaed documents, and we could do a word count on the word creation and cognates versus design and cognates. And you can see that the red line crashes in 1987 and the blue line spikes. You can do it with creationist in similar terms versus intelligent design, and you see a similar switcheroo happening in the terminology. So this strongly suggests kind of a non-random editing happened, right, in these between these drafts. And here was the one that became most famous, although we didn't actually use this in the trial because it was just too much compared to all the other evidence we had. This line, right, you can see the word creationists in the drafts. And then in the second 1987 edition, you see this version, could design proponentists, right? So you can see this was probably literally the old word processing programs in the 80s. It was things like WordPerfect, and probably they were just cutting and pasting in the word design proponents over creationists. And so we have this missing link. And I will never get tired of giving this example. It's just, it's the most perfect thing that's ever happened in terms of historical discovery, right? Like it's like literally you can see the edit in the document, right? So that's the missing link. So anyway, that was just one of, I don't know, 10 or 20 lines of evidence towards the point of view that intelligent design was a religious view. And the judge indeed ruled that this was a relabeling of creationism, and it had no place in the 9th grade science class. So I remember, being at NCSE when the ruling came down, and saw this on the newsstand, on the corner in Oakland, on the street, right? Darwin Scores in Pennsylvania Court. And the cartoonists loved this, right? They got Welcome to Dover, Pennsylvania from the Evolving Fish. And this was the another cartoon, right? The sort of evolving apes. And they say creationism turned into creation science, turned into intelligent design. And then, we're not making a lot of progress. And then there's a little comment, maybe a new name, right? And indeed, what happened after 2005 and after that big win, intelligent design, the people promoting intelligent design, they're still promoting it. But in terms of the strategies that were being used at the governmental level, right, intelligent design receded. It hasn't gone away completely, but these other sort of anti-evolution strategies like academic freedom bills or critical analysis of evolution bills became the most popular ones. And 10 years later, for the sort of 10th anniversary of Kitzmiller Dover, I'd gone and done a PhD at the UC Berkeley. I got a postdoc in Tennessee, and then I got a postdoc in Australia with a spiffy new computer. And I said, I've got a brand new computer, and it's the 10th anniversary. Maybe I could do an actual sort of phylogenetic evolutionary analysis of these anti-evolution bills, because NCSE and Eugenie Scott had noted that a lot of them shared textual similarities. They'd even produced a kind of a cartoon graphic of the evolution of these anti-evolution bills just from sort of visual inspection. And I said, well, I'm a trained phylogeneticist now with a PhD. I know a lot of computer stuff now. Maybe I could do an analysis. So this turned into this science paper called The Evolution of Anti-Evolution. And it was published in January 2016, but it came out, I think, right before the 10th anniversary. And I actually went through and coded anti-evolution strategies, all these different anti-evolution policies, and you can code sort of what their tactics are. Do they say evolution is theory, not fact, or do they ban evolution, or what language do they use? And you can do this for many, many policies, as well as the sort of post-Kitzmiller-Dover wave of policies, of which you can see there are dozens and dozens of them in various states. And I also took the actual texts and treated them like you would treat a fossil or organism or a DNA sequence. I actually lined up the texts in the computer and identified, characteristics that differed. And you can see here what we'll call a homologous sentence, right? A sentence that clearly sort of has the same ancestry, but has been modified between 2004, 2005, 2006. In the beginning, the bill expressly provides this public school student a student can't be penalized for having a particular position on origins. Students are not expressly provided a right to a position on origins. Eventually, they take out origins. I think they're trying to dodge the sort of critical heat in the press. And then, in addition, students are not expressly provided a right to positions on views, which is remarkably vague, but you can sort of see the evolutionary pathway here. So I coded all this up. Here's another one. We probably should keep it moving. But some of these bills were not just evolution. They had evolution, the chemical origins of life, random mutation, natural selection, DNA, fossil discoveries, etc. Many of them had this sort of evolution, chemical origins of life, global warming, and human cloning. But some bills would talk about global warming, some would talk about climate change, and you can code those up as varying characteristics. And then you put them into a computer, and they end up getting translated into ones and zeros, presence and absence of these different characteristics. And in this format, you can actually put them in a phylogeny estimation program and estimate a phylogenetic tree, which is a copying history, just like DNA is copied from generation to generation, and mutations can be tracked to show who's related to who. You can do the same thing with these copying histories of texts. And so I used literally evolutionary software to do this, and this produced a phylogeny of anti-evolution bills. And of course, the media kind of loved this, right? You get the evolution of anti-evolution policy, how to annoy a creationist in one complicated chart. So here's a phylogeny of those bills from 2004, 2005, up to, at the time, it was 2015. And we could map on different strategies that were being used. So here's the basic tree, the dated phylogeny. You can see the different states and years. And we can map things on like which topics are targeted here. That sort of combination of having all four: evolution, origin of life, global warming, human cloning. That was kind of originated in Ouachita Parish, Louisiana, and got fused into the main tradition, which then kind of took over and resulted in bills like the Louisiana 2008 Science Education Act and a similar one in Tennessee that was passed in 2011 that sort of call for or allow critical analysis of these four topics, right? And these policies are still in effect. It's not so clear to me, at least, what kind of effect they're having. They are pretty vague, but they're also hard. It's hard to challenge a vague policy. And so I imagine that they're at least giving a wink, wink, nod, nod to those creationist teachers out there who want to stick in some anti-evolution. But we can talk at the end about, what can be done about these. It's a non-trivial problem. You can also trace things like which states are these policies being proposed in, right? So this is what we call a phylogenetic ancestral state analysis, where the states are not just character states, they're actual U.S. states, right? So that's kind of fun. And you can see the key role that Louisiana played, blue there, the key role that Louisiana played in getting that tradition kicked off. White is Alabama. The early part of this tradition is started in Alabama. You can also look at, do they use the academic freedom language or the science education language? The early bills had academic freedom. Some of them had both, and then some had the sort of Science Education Act terminology. Do they talk about chemical evolution or chemical origins? You can trace these characters on. So ironically, the anti-evolution policies become a pretty good example data set to teach how we do phylogenetic inference and infer evolutionary histories, because it's all about shared characters that change rarely are evidence of a common copying history. And so this whole data set is online at my website, PhyloWiki. Anyone can use it if they want. If you want to learn more about this one, I did write a popular version in this Australasian Science issue, which I think I've probably put on my website, and called Creationism Evolves. And so that was one, post Kitzmiller piece of scholarship that I'm kind of proud of. Let's update you on one other topic, the bacterial flagellum, right, which is this guy right here. And the flagellum, I'll give you a little background and then talk about various evolution pieces of it. Right, the flagellum is this tail that sticks out of bacteria, and it actually rotates. And that rotating motion makes sort of a spiral corkscrew shape that pushes the bacterium along. Just to give you a sense of it, although the word flagellum is also used for the swimming structures of eukaryotic cells, like human cells, right? We have cilia or flagella in our lungs. Sperm have cilia or flagella that they use to swim. We have little cilia in our ears, for example. But that structure, although it sticks out and it wiggles and it helps things swim or it moves fluid along, that structure is entirely different than the bacterial flagellum. And this is a two-scale comparison, right? So the eukaryotic structure is this huge thing made of tubulin. The bacterial flagellum is 10 times smaller. It's on the small bacteria, and it functions in a completely different way. So just so that's clear. Back in 2005, I kind of did an analysis. We were like, well, how do we deal with this irreducible complexity argument? And Behe said all of these systems had no sort of evolutionary literature. It was pretty apparent, if you actually looked at the literature, that the immune system in particular had a lot of literature on its evolution. And I mentioned why. There's a massive amount of medical funding for immune system research. Comparative immunology is this old field that goes back 100 years. We actually wrote an article in Nature Immunology about this after the trial. So the immune system was kind of the strong one, even though it's preposterously complex. It's quite a strong one to make the evolution case. The one system that Behe was kind of right about back in the 90s was the flagellum, right? There was really not much work on the evolution of the flagellum back in the 90s, early 2000s. And partially this is because, it's not such a key system as the immune system for human health, but it's also much older. I mean, the immune system is only as old as vertebrates, so it's only 450 or 500 million years old. The flagellum is as old as bacteria, and it's thought it probably does go back to the common ancestor of bacteria. So it could be 3 billion years old. And so, the amount of information that gets lost over that amount of time is much more substantial. So this one really was a challenge, and this is something that got me curious. So there's the flagellum from Michael Behe's book, Darwin's Black Box. Here it is on the cover of Bill Dembski's No Free Lunch Intelligent Design book. And this, I mentioned this to Jeannie before the talk. This led to one of my first publications, which was actually in the Bay Area Skeptics information sheet in 2004. And I kind of assembled, as a hobby, I had written an online article about the evolution of the flagellum. And this was kind of a summary of it. And I'd gone through the flagellum proteins to see, well, which ones really are required parts, which ones have known homologies, and so I sort of assembled a survey of relevant literature on the evolution of the flagellum. And I'll take you through that now and then give you an update. So here is one image of a flagellum. This is actually an average of dozens of images on an electron microscope, but it gives you a sense of what this thing looks like. It's this rotating structure, and it is amazingly complex. It's a stunning structure, right? But let's talk about the parts of the flagellum. The flagellum sits in the membrane of a bacterium, and so the outer membrane is at the top. That's the part facing the outside. There's a cell wall, and there's an inner membrane in your sort of standard E. coli sort of bacterium. And inside of that is the cytoplasm, and outside of that is the outside of the cell. And there's there's different parts to the flagellum. There's a series of proteins that constitute an export apparatus that take proteins and unfold them and stick them through the inner membrane to start building the rod and the hook and the flagellum on the outside of the cell. This is called the export apparatus. There's these rings that go through the cell wall and the outer membrane, L and P ring. And then there's this long tube made of about a dozen different kinds of proteins that eventually result in the main filament, which is out here. But they get exported in a particular order to build this tube, and then the parts get secreted through the inside of the tube and stuck on at the end. So the whole thing is incredible. You can see why Behe would like it. It's the filament and the hook rod, etc. And then the motors, the proteins that power this whole thing and make it rotate, they're called MOT A and B, and they're the purple proteins here, and they form a ring of these complexes around the outside, and ions, charged ions, flow through these and make these motor proteins move, and they push on this orange part and make the base move, which rotates the whole thing. So, it is a legitimate scientific question. How in the hell could something like that evolve, right? That is not a wrong question to ask. And then there's other bits that attach to the chemotaxis. So the bacteria aren't just moving randomly. Often they are sensing the concentration of different nutrients, and there's part of the structure helps those concentrations influence which direction the flagellum turns. All right, so I did some analyses back then, which parts are really required, found in all flagella for function. And it turns out some of these are not. Gram-positive bacteria lack an outer membrane, and they lack this outer ring. So those parts aren't, strictly speaking, required. This chemotaxis system isn't present in all bacteria. So it's not all these parts are always found and always required. And then actually after the Kitzmiller trial in around 2010, it was discovered that even this part of the secretion system isn't, strictly speaking, required. You can do a deletion and still get slower secretion, but it's not strictly required. So that's quite interesting. And then even of the required parts, we can ask which of these protein parts are only really required for function in the flagellum, which are only found in the flagellum, and which of them have what we call homologs, evolutionary relatives, outside of the flagellum doing other things. There's kind of a paradigm going back a long ways to Darwin and Ernst Mayr that says complex structures arise by co-option of function, changing function. So, bird wings didn't start out as wings. They started out as dinosaur forelimbs. Penguin flippers didn't start as flippers. They started as bird wings. This change of function thing is very, very important in evolution. And so it makes sense that perhaps the way you can build up a complex biochemical structure is by co-opting parts that have other functions. And if that's true, we should expect to hopefully see some of these homologous systems doing other things out there in nature. And so this was part of what I did. Even before I worked at NCSE, I wrote kind of a long online essay that probably helped me get hired, actually, doing this kind of analysis. And it turns out here's some of the main homologies. These axial proteins, the flagellum, the flagellum, and the hook and the rod, all kind of form a protein family. These motor proteins are homologous to ion transport proteins. Type 3 secretion is one of many kinds of secretion, but it turns out there's versions of this type 3 secretion system that function in non-motility contexts. They're virulent systems, for example, and even signal transduction is another category. So many of these parts have homologies in other systems. And here's a table from about 2005 indicating what these homologies are. So we've got the flagellum components on the left. Some of these proteins are homologous to other flagellum proteins, right? So they're copies of each other that have been modified. And so especially that axial protein family, that's 10 or 12 proteins that are all related to each other. And then some of them, like this ATPase that helps proteins be secreted, that's homologous to something called the F1-FO ATPase, which is in all of your mitochondria. The thing that generates ATP, the energy currency of the cell, is an F1-FO ATPase, and it turns out that several of those proteins have a very similar structure to several flagellum proteins. So that was 2005. And in 2006, I wrote an article with Mark Palin called From the Origin of Species to the Origin of Bacterial Flagella. And you can go look that up if you want to learn more about this kind of argument. That was the case in 2005. I've updated this recently, since now recently we've got a grant. We have new students working on some of these proteins. And despite my main thing being biogeography, I still maintain an interest in all of this sort of evolution of dispersal topic. So there's the 2005 table. Here's 2025, and you'll see a few interesting things that I've updated. First, there's some more internal homologies. Fly P, Q, and R in the inner membrane here are actually homologous to each other. And then it turns out that a lot of these type 3 secretion proteins are homologous to a system called SPO3A, which is a sporulation system in bacteria like Bacillus. So part of the ways that Bacillus, which is things like anthrax, part of the ways that they are able to survive drying out, they can be transmitted in dust, is that they can sporulate when conditions are harsh. And part of that sporulation system involves a series of rings in the inner membrane that exports different proteins. And it turns out that a number of those appear to be homologous to type 3 secretion and flagellum secretion system proteins. And so there's been a whole argument about, is the type 3 secretion system derived from the flagellum? And the latest papers say that it is. But whether or not that's true, it's true that many of these other proteins seem to have a very distant homologue. You can barely detect it, but once you get structural data, it's pretty strong that there's this other system. So it looks like, like many, many other stories in evolution, you get simpler systems, they evolve to have a variety of functions, and then they get co-opted for more complex functions. There's a few other ones here. If we look at those motor proteins, some homologues were known back in 2005, but a bunch more have been discovered. And I'll show you a little bit about those. One other kind of story to talk about is that there's other kinds of homology beyond just, this protein's got a similar sequence to that protein. Another one is the order of genes. And so in my sort of picking around at the flagellum story, I came across this pattern, and then I had a student look at it and verify it, that said that the homologies between the flagellum and these ATPases that are in your mitochondria and in many, many bacteria, et cetera, not only are there these shared proteins with shared structures, but it looks like the gene order is conserved. And so, here's those proteins. We're looking at the red and orange colored ones here. And we can actually look at their order in the genome. So in something like E. coli, the kind of lab rat of bacteria, these 3 proteins are Fly H, I, and J in the bacterial genome. And they were actually labeled in the lab. They were labeled alphabetically, or they were given alphabetical labels in the order in which they're on the bacterial chromosome. So H, I, J are called that because they're next to each other in gene order. Okay, so HIJ make up that basal export ATPase, and many, many bacteria have HIJ. It's not quite always true, but it's often true. And so what's interesting is if you look at E. coli, look at their ATP synthetases, these F1-FO ATPases, they have a homologous ATPase protein, and then they have two proteins known as FOB and F1 delta that combined basically make up the structure of FlyH. And typically those proteins, sometimes fused, are the gene just before this ATPase protein. And then they have a second protein. This is kind of an inner stalk protein called F1 gamma, and it almost always follows that ATPase protein. The F1-FO ATPase is actually two copies of their ATPase protein. So there's the second beta copy over here, but this order of the beta, delta, alpha, and then gamma eerily has usually the same order as the ones in the flagellum. And here's more evidence that we assembled of this. Even in archaea bacteria, archaea often have a similar arrangement of the homologous proteins, right? There's some variation, but it's pretty good. And so what this means, if you just step back and think, this means that not only were these proteins shared and go way, way back before the flagellum to some ancestral, probably some kind of early secretion system, not only do those proteins go way, way back, probably before the last common ancestor of modern life, right? Even the genes are in the same order, and that's been preserved for, what, 3.5 billion years. These genes have been kept in the same order, probably because there's these proteins work together, and probably the easiest way to get them expressed together is to have them next to each other in the chromosome. So I think that's an amazing story. We got a bioassays article out of it, and I still challenge people, can you find an older case of the conservation of gene order than that one? Because this is going back before the last common ancestor of life. So that's kind of fun. What other stuff is going on in flagellum evolution? There was this amazing review paper published by Morgan Beebe in 2020, and he outlined there's many more protein structures that are available, and these ribbon diagrams are kind of cartoons that give you the structure of the backbone of a protein chain. And this was a very handy graphic in pointing out the structural similarities between flagellum proteins and non-flagellum ones. And many of these are ones that I showed you in the table, but this gives you the sort of visual impression. You can see Fly P, Q, and R sort of share a repeated structure. They form a repeated sort of ring that helps the secretion gateway happen. You can see actually this work is advanced. I'll show you that in a minute. These are some of those filament proteins that all share a common core. And so we've got a manuscript that's being submitted hopefully this week or next week on the MOT-AB proteins, those motor proteins, comparing the flagellum motor proteins, which are over here on the right, to their non-flagellar homologs here on the left. And we don't have a lot of time to go through this, but suffice it to say there's a variety of these motor complexes. So the ones on the left here are the motor proteins of E. coli or Vibrio, which is bacteria like cholera. Those are the TGI4s. But then there's these non-flagellar motor proteins that do other things. They use that ion flow to energize other processes, like ion transport. They can transport different kinds of iron and other nutrients that the bacteria need. And you can see the structures, they're not identical, but there's some similar structures across this. So the ones on the left are doing flagellum rotation, and the ones on the right are doing things like importing metal ions. There's another version called AGLRS. That's AGL is adventitious gliding. And some bacteria use a similar set of proteins to help them glide, which means slide along the surface. And the exact mechanism of how that works is not fully understood, but they use a similar motor protein. And there's even this other thing recently discovered called Zoria, which has a very similar basic structure that somehow serves as a defense against phages, right? Phage infections. And somehow this they may rotate this structure inside the cell and somehow use that to catch invading phage DNA or something like that. Anyway, we used some of this information to try and reconstruct a structural history of the flagellum and the non-flagellum branches of the family. And so I think I just want to impress on you the kind of level of detail we're starting to get to on some of these proteins. We're working on these proteins one or two at a time. I hope at some amount of time to kind of be able to assemble a bigger overall picture. One of the things that's helping us with this is that we now have a new kind of data called 3DI structural characters. And this is a whole talk just to explain, but basically we can, in addition to having amino acids from the protein chain, we have a way to encode structural variety in a sequence format. And these are very, very conserved characters. And so we have the exact same amino acid and structural character data sets for these different motor proteins here. And the ones on the right are these structural characters, and they're very highly conserved. So this may let us look back further in evolutionary history than we could before. Here's that fly PQR system where these things are related to each other. They form kind of a tube in the beginning of the tube, and they form a gate to allow proteins to be exported. And I've had students this year working on aligning these. And what's interesting is the amino acid alignments. These are so distantly related. The amino acid alignments are pretty tough across fly P, fly Q, and fly R, which are the three big groups. But the structural characters are much stronger. And we can see that on the right here, if we just color in the columns of this amino acid alignment that are more than 50% conserved. The amino acids on the left, you have only a few conserved positions. It's very hard to do phylogenies with that. But on the right, we have these structural characters, and many more positions are strongly conserved. So I think there's, some reason for optimism that we'll be able to trace these evolutionary histories further. All right, I've given you quite a lot. I just have a couple closing thoughts on all of this. What are the challenges to science and science education today? And one thing I've been thinking about a lot, just perhaps my own interests, but it's kind of come across my plate, is so the Kitzmiller case was about challenging pseudoscience and religious attempts, political attempts to interfere in science education. And in one sense, it was making a big deal out of a small thing, right? Who really cares if one school district in Dover, Pennsylvania puts a little bit of fluff into their biology education? The world wouldn't end. It wouldn't be the end of the republic, if that happened. So why have a cow, man? The reason was that clearly in that case, it was a test case. And if, you allow the Constitution to be violated in one instance, right, you can, that strategy gets spread all over, and you end up with many, many states and many, many thousands, hundreds of thousands of students getting poor science education. You have a less educated public. So it is important to have those sorts of cases to challenge these things when they arise. I would say I'll just mention two of these things that I've been involved in more recently, where I think that, taking a principled stand about something where you feel like maybe something's being gotten wrong is worth doing, even when it's maybe your own side. I've been on the political left my whole life. I've always voted Democrat, but I found myself on the opposite side of a number of evolutionist colleagues and friends over certain issues in recent years. And one of them is this case of canceling famous evolutionists, right? So in 2020, 2021, there were attempts, some of them successful, to dename prizes, dename buildings and awards named after famous evolutionary biologists. And some of that might have been justified, but some of it I think clearly was not. So one of them was the Ernst Mayr Award from the Society of Systematic Biology, which was co-founded and funded by Ernst Mayr. In the sort of move to take down statues and get back at Trump and all of these things, I think some unfortunate targets were done back in 2020, 2021. And one of them was Ernst Mayr. And I and some other people like David Hillis pushed back hard and just barely, got enough votes to prevent Ernst Mayr's name from being taken off of their one named prize in that society. And so, I had to sort of assemble an argument about what did Ernst Mayr actually say and think about racism. It turned out, for his day, he was, I would say, a leading anti-racist in terms of a biologist talking about the issue. A lot of our modern arguments about race, that race is not categorical. There's no such thing as clear racial categories. We're all just one big human population. It's all just clines and gene flow. All of that stuff comes from Ernst Mayr, basically, right? That's the modern synthesis, Ernst Mayr and Theodosius Dobzhansky. And so seeing his name get denamed in some sort of, attempt to get at racism and get at Trump really struck me the wrong way. There was a similar battle about T.H. Huxley, right, Darwin's bulldog, who we had this bizarre phenomenon where, in the cause of name of social justice, people were looking up creationist websites that said bad things about T.H. Huxley and then sort of presenting those unfiltered, not critically analyzed, as arguments for why T.H. Huxley was racist. You can read my essay here. T.H. Huxley was a man of the 1800s. It's not like he had fully modern views, but he was very progressive for his day. He was a radical in the sense of the 1800s. He really strongly supported the inclusion of women in science, for example. He really undermined race in a lot of ways. You can read this essay if you're interested. So I find that, being a critical thinker, sometimes you're a critical thinker and everyone agrees with you. Like in the case, everyone on your political side agrees with you, like the case in the Kitzmiller case. But sometimes being a critical thinker, trying to be a scholar, sometimes you end up being a critic of people who, generally speaking, you have sympathy with. The one other example I'll show you of this is here in New Zealand. When I moved to New Zealand, I never thought there'd be any kind of science education issue here. It's a kind of a liberal place. They don't have a strong fundamentalist movement. But again, in the sort of 2020, 2021 era, we've had quite an interesting thing happen, which is that a sort of modern progressive cause is to promote indigenous knowledge. And in general, I think that's fine. I think indigenous knowledge hasn't gotten sufficient attention in the history of science, right? Indigenous peoples, of course, have faced many hardships, many kinds of oppression over the years. I think paying attention to indigenous knowledge is great, but you got to be careful about how you do it, especially in a science class. And so here is something that was on the New Zealand Ministry of Education website as, in this case, a pilot course outline for chemistry. They're giving the big ideas in chemistry to students, and they say, they're talking about atoms and particles and atomic bonds, and they have this saying, Mori is present in all matter. All particles have their own Mori and presence as part of a larger whole, for example, within a molecule, polymer of salt, right? When the substance is burnt, they remain with their own Mori. And Mori is a concept of life force, right? It's basically a vitalist concept. And when I saw this, I shook my head and slapped my forehead. It brought me right back to the kind of days of Kitzmiller Dover, because it was, if this kind of thing is allowed to sort of go into science education without any criticism, what are you doing? This is essentially a supernatural concept. Vitalism was debunked in science in the 1800s. What are we doing here? Can we let this slide? Maybe it's not a big deal. Maybe no one believes it, but I think this was a case where a kind of progressive instinct to bend over backwards and be super accommodating to, previously suppressed things like indigenous knowledge, got a little bit out of hand, and there wasn't enough critical thinking allowed. It's pretty clear that sort of in the zeitgeist of the time, critical objections to this were being suppressed. Science teachers who objected were basically told to shut up and get with the program. This was all part of a quest towards higher and better ways of thinking and educating students. And of course, it all came apart within a few years, because the scientists and professors of science are like, look, we can support this in general, but we can't have life forces in chemistry. The whole basis of chemistry and biochemistry is built on the concept that this is all material stuff, right? So eventually I ended up writing a letter to science, rebutting some of the kind of rosy talk about indigenous knowledge that had neglected some of these uncomfortable episodes. You can read that if you like. That came out in Science last year. And I think this issue continues, right? Because it's anytime you get in a situation where skepticism is frowned upon because it's not with whatever the political program is, right? You're going to have these kinds of problems. Okay, so that's my mini rant on that topic, but it does remind me, right, of some of the same issues come up, but not always in such a comfortable way. Okay, so conclusion, history is important. If you want to see these articles and things, you can go to my CV, which is at this link. I'll try and put up these slides and put a link on the YouTube site so people can find them. Here's a cartoon about the flagellum from that 2005 era, which you can look at. So that's my talk. Thank you so much for listening. I hope I didn't go on too incredibly long, and I'm happy to take questions if there are any. I've probably got 20 minutes or so if we need it. Cool. So I'll end the show there.
Yay! Thank you, Nick. That was really fun, and I was perfectly content to go through the
good old days,
the history of the trial and how we came up with the information for it, and because it's a good story. It really is a good story. Speaking of intelligent design, I was reminded when you were talking about Behe and his irreducible complexity, that it always seemed to me that there were only two scientific ideas in intelligent design. I mean, there's all kinds of other ideas that are extra scientific, but in terms of getting their stuff in the classroom, they really pounded away at Behe's irreducible complexity, of course, but also Dembski's complex specified information, the various hand waving having to do with information theory that he came up with. And they're actually, a lot of them, there's a lot of overlap if you sort of look at the 10,000 or 15,000 foot level. I mean, both of these are basically saying, gee whiz, here's a phenomenon that's just so complicated it couldn't possibly have a natural explanation. Therefore, poof, therefore there was some intelligent agent involved in all of this. And I've always been struck at what a science stopper that is. That if you go into trying to explain something in nature with the attitude that got to stop here because this is just so complicated, we can't possibly explain it, you are guaranteed to never explain it. If you don't try, you're never gonna make it. But back to good old irreducible complexity, I really was fascinated to see the detail that's taken place in the field of just the flagellum. I mean, I'm sure the same thing's going on in the immune system and the other biochemical enthusiasms that Behe focuses upon. But I was just astonished at how much detail and just real nitty gritty stuff that you went into. But go ahead.
I was just going to say briefly, some of that is, you've heard of AI, right?
Yes, indeed.
Part of it is there's been this AI revolution and this time I would say it's a good revolution in protein structure. In the olden days, the only way to get a protein structure was a very elaborate experiment with X-rays and crystallizing a protein, and you could only do it for a certain percentage of proteins, and it was a major effort. Over the years, they've been working on computational prediction, where you can put in the amino acid sequence, which you can get from DNA sequencing, and get out a prediction of the structure. And that has basically been solved now using AI. It's not totally perfect, but it's really, really good. And so suddenly we have structures for everything, and you can start to see these additional similarities that weren't obvious just from the sequences. And so this is AlphaFold, which you might have heard of. And anyway, I think they already got a Nobel Prize for AlphaFold, but it's really revolutionized all of this. And then the bit that I'm working on is using some of that to improve our phylogenetics, right? So it's a big opportunity. So anyway, yeah, continue on.
But just, I was curious, even back in 2005, the work that you had done, which was compared to the stuff you showed us today, relatively, quote, simple. I mean, relatively baby steps. There was the beginning. You put together a lot of information and produced a very plausible explanation for how the parts of the bacterial flagellum could have evolved. And of course, Behe was not convinced. But I confess, and fine, I've been retired for 11 years now. Time flies. And so I don't think anybody expects me to be keeping up with intelligent design. Do you know whether irreducible complexity is still the kind of poster child sine qua non of ID, or have they sort of, pushed that aside? And B, whether if that is the case, which I would think it might be, has Behe changed his attitudes in any respect, or the other ID proponents changed their ideas about the specific bacterial flagellum being this very complex and very precise example of irreducible complexity?
Yeah, I have not seen any give on that side. Behe did, he published a couple of other books, which I took a look at. I wrote a review of one of them. The second one, that was quite early, like 2007, I think. It did give in. It kind of slightly moved the debate from this general issue of irreducible complexity, and I kind of gave you the response about change of function. He sort of moved it specifically to the evolution of protein-protein binding sites. So, there's these specific three-dimensional structures that help two proteins stick together. And so you can ask how those evolved. And he had a very sort of tortuous argument about why that this couldn't happen. even though, I wrote a book review and I looked up studies where it had happened, in the lab. And I think maybe the key thing is sort of the failure to realize that binding, his failure maybe to fully realize that binding is kind of a continuous thing, and you can have a little bit of sticking or a lot of sticking, and it's really just a matter of mutations that increase or decrease that. So that was the one that I followed closely. There's been another book since then that I don't recall having much to it. So I haven't seen any developments. They sort of maintain their own little journal, and they publish. They're still going more on the specified complexity stuff a bit. I haven't seen much more development. And I do think, I think Rob Pennock wrote an essay probably 5 or 10 years ago that's kind of said that the movement had stalled out. The true believers are still kind of pushing it, but the amount of attention they get seems pretty limited. And I don't know how much of that is just kind of the exhaustion of the original idea, or the recognition that maybe even for them it's not that interesting if they're not really going to try and get it into schools. Like how much of it are they genuinely interested, and how much do they just want something to get something into schools? They pretty much gave up on the school strategy, so maybe that makes it less interesting. And then I think the sort of general conservative world has, I would say, moved to a totally different set of issues. It's at the moment, it's obviously much more about Trump and Trumpism, and a lot less about classic fundamentalism, although obviously there's some connections, but you don't hear the same kinds of issues being prioritized at the moment.
I think that's true, but intelligent design is still wafting about in the atmosphere, because there have been a couple of, and you can go to, not you personally, but one can go to the NCSC website and find examples in legislation submitted last year and this year that do specifically mention intelligent design.
Yeah, so West Virginia had one. Yeah.
Even if the folks in the Discovery Institute, which is the think tank for ID, having replaced the poor old Foundation for Thought and Ethics, but even if the folks at the Discovery Institute have not been breathing hard and heavy on pushing ID in the schools, there are acolytes around who may be trying to take advantage of that situation. Now, you're probably aware of the Kennedy versus Bremerton legal decision up in Washington State a couple of years ago, where Lemon versus Kurtzman, which was the precedent that was used in all of the creation and evolution cases since the mid-70s. But Lemon was struck down by the Supreme Court as a way of determining whether a bill or practice satisfies the Establishment Clause. And now the Establishment Clause jurisprudence is a Wild West. We have no idea how the court is going to, what kind of criteria the court is going to use. So it'll be very interesting to talk to some of our Kitzmiller lawyer friends when we have our reunion in August.
Times, and the history of this issue.
Yeah.
Has been, it kind of comes roaring back once everyone's forgotten about the previous round. Because I think what Stephen Jay Gould or someone said in the 60s, this evolution issue was a thing in the 20s and it's pretty much over. That didn't turn out to be right. So
that specifically was right after McLean.
Was it? Okay.
He had an op-ed because he was one of the expert witnesses for McLean versus Arkansas in 1981. And he wrote an article, I think in 82, saying, well, we don't have to worry about creationism anymore. We won.
Yeah.
Do you remember that? Are you a fan of oh, come on, the Stanford mathematician who wrote all the parody songs? On the tip of my frontal lobe, and of course it has just slid off. But anyway, it'll come in a moment. But he wrote all of these very funny parody songs, and there was this one about, remember the war against Franco, that's the kind where each of us belongs. Though they may have won all the battles, we had all the good songs. And they do have all the good songs. But there was another one that he wrote about, once all the Germans were warlike and mean, but that couldn't happen again. We taught them a lesson in 1918, and they've hardly bothered us since then. So that's kind of
the musical interlude. That's great.
Tom Lear. That's who I'm trying to remember.
Tom Lear.
Tom Lear.
So,
Brilliant.
oh, that's amazing. Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right. You got to,
You got to keep
vigilant, right?
looking
Is
over
one of
your
the things,
shoulder.
but
The, these things, these things have a resonance with members of the public. Even though I totally agree that the conservative issues, the culture war issues, are much more having to do with sex and practices and of course
immigration. Yeah.
Immigration. Yes, exactly.
Yep.
You mentioned AI, and that just about how useful AI is in terms of solving some of these structural protein problems. And it reminded me of something that's been making me nervous. And this has to do with, of course, generative AI, which I don't know if that's quite the same thing that you're talking about. I think you may be dealing with something somewhat more.
Honestly, I'm not an AI expert.
More sophisticated, but generative AI is going great guns. And what worries me is when generative AI can be trained on everything in the internet, which includes all of these creationist sites. And generative AI has no discernment. It has no idea whether it's dealing with the Discovery Institute or the Institute for Creation Research or AAAS, the science magazine. It said, okay, here's some words. I'm just going to digest them. And so I'm wondering at what point in the future are we going to see, a query on creation and evolution answered with information from creationist sites.
Yeah, I haven't seen that, but it seems entirely plausible, right? I'll tell you one thing I did randomly notice, which is, students use AI a lot, and to draft things, and there's perhaps arguments you can have about that. But one thing I've noticed is that the flagellum, because the term flagellum gets used for these actually three different structures: the bacterial one, the eukaryote one, and the archaea one. Right? There's three different things that stick out of a cell and wiggle and help move the cell. That apparently confuses AI sometimes, because it thinks that this literature about this protein in the flagellum must be connected to this other literature about this protein in the other flagellum, and you get the stuff mixed in the AI summaries, right? And they start inferring one thing from the other system, and it really, once if you know them, you're like, oh my God, that's just all confused and wrong. So that's the kind of thing that can happen. Honestly, humans get confused if they're early on and they don't realize there's these three different kinds of flagella, right? But yeah, it can be disturbing if that ends up in a student sort of product, right? So yeah, that's something to pay attention to.
Well, I can talk with you all night, and that would not be fair. Let us turn to the questions from some of our listeners. Larry Parks asks, what are your views, both of you please, on highly creditable scientists, from astrophysicists to paleoanthropology, accepting funding from the Templeton Foundation? You first.
Yeah, sure. So I guess I do have a view on that. I will concede that in the 90s, right, the Templeton I think they funded a little bit of Dembski work and a little bit of other stuff that I would consider, dubious. However, my impression has been that in recent years, even in the 90s, I think they pulled back on that. And in recent decades, I think they've mostly funded mainstream research. It is conceivable that my opinion on this may be colored by the fact that now I am a researcher myself and always seeking funding. And honestly, one of the few sources of funding for basic science in origins and evolution that's especially international, that's accessible to someone like me from New Zealand, is Templeton Foundation money. So I've applied. I've never gotten one, but I did apply last year for a grant from them to do flagellum evolution kinds of work, right? And I will probably do it again. I would not compromise on any of my scientific values, but the bits that perhaps remain that are maybe a little bit, if you're concerned about religion and science, right, it seems pretty tame to me. Like the bit that you could detect now is that they have an interest in agency, right? Agency in biology, agency in behavior. And, so that word is something that, is the kind of grant they're looking for. And on my interpretation, that doesn't bother me, because there is a sense in which, even if you're just interested in the flagellum, right, what does the flagellum do? It moves the bacterium from poor conditions to better conditions. that is some kind of, sensory input output system, right? That's the beginning of organismal behavior. And many of the other organismal behaviors out there are probably more complex elaborations on that kind of input output system. And eventually you get decision making systems, and you could call that agency, and that seems like a legitimate thing to study, right? So I'm fine with that. I know Jerry Coyne and others are have previously been skeptical. I don't know what they think nowadays, but that would be my position, that basically it's fine, and in this environment, take what money you can. Is kind of where I'm at on it. So yeah.
Yeah, I think, well, Templeton's been around for a long time now, almost 30 years or something. Like they've been around for a long time. I forget how long I've been around sometimes. But I think in the early, like you, I think in the early years, there were some eyebrows raised with some of the things that they funded. I remember once they funded some research on the efficacy of prayer, which was a little, questionable as far as the scientific merit of something like that. But the thing is that there's some good people at Templeton, and they learned from these kinds of things. I wasn't aware that they had funded some of the ID people like Dembski, but maybe they learned that, oh, wait, there is no there. And that they have not funded that sort of research. So I also, money's money. Their money's as green as anybody else's.
Yeah.
But what matters is
the Dembski book. But I don't know. Yeah.
Pardon?
I think it was Dembski writing a book, and maybe he got a advance or whatever on the book. You gotta experiment. No funding agency hits a home run every time, to mix a metaphor. I mean, if you are a funding agency, or you are a private foundation, you're going to fund some clunkers once in a while. And the important thing is that you learn and don't keep doing it. Could we have another question, please? Troy Britton asks Nick, how have the many predictions made by ID proponents about the demise of evolution and its replacement by ID in academia fared after 20 years? Now, that's what I call a softball. That's a softball. Hi, Troy. Yeah, well, that's a good question, because there are some famous quotes, and actually we should dig them up and repopularize them, right? Because Dembski, I believe in particular, maybe the thing called the wedge strategy, which was the Discovery Institute wedge strategy, right? They had some timelines for when they were going to, revolutionize the culture and return it to what they considered the good values and good beliefs. And the timelines have well since passed now, right? It was kind of this 5-10 year scheme, right, for returning design to the core of the culture and all that. And so, nothing much came of that. I think the Kitzmiller thing, really put a spoke in the wheels there. And I don't know what they've said or if they've revisited that lately. I mean, Dembski, in a sense, moved away from intelligent design. Mm-hmm. I don't think he abandoned the belief. Theology, I think. Yeah, he moved more towards theology, and and he had some theological controversies, because it's, in the world of conservative religion, if you don't have just the right views, right, people may not hire you for wherever you are. So there were some young earth, old earth debates that he was got on the wrong side of, is my vague memory. This was all 10 or more years ago. So anyway, so life can be challenging, right, in that sense. So I think that specific one has gone away. I do think it's worth paying attention to that sort of program, the sort of idea that, by getting something into the schools, we can then achieve our political objectives or get everyone move, change the culture to the way we want to be. We can do social engineering. Those sorts of instincts are not only present on the right. And I mentioned the case in New Zealand, right? How do you get vitalism into a chemistry class? How does that occur? The number of things that have to go wrong for that to happen are substantial, right? Because you sort of got to override all the just kind of plain old boring science teachers and scientists and have some other objective going on that gets that to happen. And it's pretty clear in New Zealand, it was a case of an ideological program from previous government that kind of decided, now is the time to do some social engineering, move the culture the direction we want to go. And it's very complex to explain. It involves almost the sort of attempt to create a new sort of social contract and kind of almost a civic religion. sort of like the U.S. has civic religion. There's a sort of desire for a New Zealand one to be a certain way. And this was all kind of entrained in that program. And it led to the predictable train crashes when it came to something like science education. So that's why I like to say, I like to quote my dad, right? He may be listening. I saw my mom's listening. My dad says, when you mix politics and science, what do you get? Well, you get politics, right? So that's kind of my philosophy on these things. Is that, let's just leave the science to the scientists. Try, the point of a science class is to teach good science. It's not to, win every other social, political goal that you've got, and let's just, let's save that for other classes. Let's try and make science classes about science.
Very good. Is there another question, please? Radiation Bill says, have any of the players arguing for the ID side of Kitzmiller come around to our side in the intervening years?
Boy, I can't remember any. There's cases like Dembski where they kind of de-emphasized it as an interest. And I know some small scale players, like people we used to argue with on the internet. Some of them would move, but I don't recall any major figures have. Some of them have passed away. Some of them have, become other figures in other movements maybe. But I don't know if anyone has changed their mind at that level.
I don't know any either. Is there another question, please? Howard Winnett asks, have you read the Evaluations of U.S. Science Teaching by John Rudolph? How We Teach Science, Why We Teach Science. Those are two of his articles.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that. No.
He's an interesting guy. Howard's got me reading him too. It's worthwhile taking a look at. He has some constructive ideas. Last question, please. Oh, and it's Jay's. How close did we come to losing this? And how safe are we from challenges going forward?
Oh, those are good ones. So I actually watched the previous Bay Area Skeptics video where this topic came up, I think a month ago or whatever. And the kind of framing in that talk was a little bit like, they almost won in that case, except that, things like the drafts of the Pandas book were discovered. And while gratifying in kind of a storytelling way from my point of view, it's nice to, we found the key thing and that got them. I actually don't think the case was going that way. I think, while it was amazing to find those drafts and have that part of the story, I think if none of that had ever occurred, it would have mostly gone the same way. I think the evidence was so strong from so many directions that having those drafts was just kind of the icing on the cake. The evidence from the school board having, particular sectarian motives, right, was very, very strong. Mm-hmm. The general evidence that intelligent design had originated as a relabeling of creationism, that it was also very strong, right? You didn't need the exact drafts of the Pandas book to prove that. That had already been argued in detail by Robert Pennock and Barbara Forrest and Eugenie Scott, et cetera, et cetera. And so there was a lot of general arguments you could make. And even just the line in Pandas about, sudden appearance by an intelligent agency, that by itself, I think, probably crossed the line, right? It was just more amazing to show that the previous language was that creation language, right? But I think the case was pretty strong without that. And I think Judge Jones, in retrospect, we didn't know this starting out, but he was the kind of judge you want to have, a really intelligent, thoughtful judge who will listen, and consider all the evidence and make a determination, not somebody who's just an ideologue. And so that was, given that was the case, that was good. Part of the reason we kind of went, you go in armed to the teeth and you make every argument you can is you don't know going in what kind of judge it'll be, which thing will be convincing, and so you sort of prepare as if this judge is a real right winger who would really love to support the other side, and you just try and make it hard for him to do so, and so I think that was why you just pile on the evidence, right? And it also serves as a record for future cases, for future debates about these things.
Yeah. The amount of information we massed is that's MASSED, massed, we massed together, was so substantial. I think it would discourage. In fact, we know, because there was another case in Georgia that was going to go to appeals court, And the Dover lawyers showed up to sort of augment the good guys in that case. And suddenly the other side wanted to settle. And we don't know for sure. They did say, oh, wow, you guys know what you're doing about this topic, so we want to settle. But it happened. But I mean, you alluded to this a little bit when you said that the science of intelligent design is really terrible, and why would you want to teach it? You alluded to the reason why we had to craft the case the way we crafted it, and that is because we were dealing with law, not science, and we could have tried this case without bringing up science at all. It would have been a whole lot harder. But the issue was, is intelligent design a religious argument? And if it is a religious argument, is it constitutional to teach it? The only way it would be constitutional to teach it is if there was a secular reason for doing so. Just like you can teach about Mohammed or Jesus, you just can't advocate what Mohammed. You can't say Jesus was right. As long as there's a secular reason for bringing religion into the classroom, you can do it. What we had to do is show that there was no secular reason whatsoever for intelligent design. It was crappy science. It miseducated kids. What is it that Badian said? It made them dumber.
Yep.
It didn't really make them dumber, because they're either dumb or smart, depending on it did make them more ignorant, that's for sure. And that is what we had to show. So the question of whether we could go through this again, and how close we were to losing, we were not very close to losing, because the evidence was so clear that it was a religious position and there was no secular reason for doing it. What's the secular reason for teaching bad science? So we had to show the science was bad, or we chose to show the science was bad. And whether it'll happen again, well, what are the criteria for a policy being declared in a violation of the Establishment Clause? We don't know. So even though Kitzmiller was extremely helpful under the Lemon versus Kurtzman rules, we don't know what's going to go on today. But we do know that we amassed one whale of a lot of information on the history of intelligent design, the concepts and their lack of scholarly support. And it was largely because of the work that NCSC did with the lawyers. And like I said in my introduction, you, Nick, were the ones we all helped in various ways, but you were the guy who spent the whole blasted year on this trial. And because you were the person best able to deal with the huge variety of issues that were involved in this case. And I'm extremely happy that you came to work for me.
Well, it was an amazing experience, Jeannie. I will never forget it, and it still amazes me today that I got to play a part in that. I will say, a lot of the stuff I did, right, only could happen at NCSC because because they had the archives and the materials and the contacts, right. One of the key documents was we ended up contacting what's his name in Texas, John somebody. Texas, North Texas Skeptics or something. He had a box in his closet that had a key document in it. That only happened because of the connections, right? So,
which, by the way, is now at the American Philosophical Society.
The archives.
NCSC, the vast majority of NCSC archives, which is very cool. But I don't know if you remember, but it wasn't. I think it might even have been the last day of the trial or something. But I remember you and I sitting down for lunch, and I remember you talking a little bit about, my parents are after me to go back to graduate school. You'd worked at NCSC for a couple of years now, and we cherished you every moment that you worked there. But I remember you saying, my parents are bugging. I said, I'm going to bug you too. You really ought to quit, and you really ought to go to graduate school. And I hated doing it because I so loved working with you.
Well, that turned out to be an amazing experience too. But it was a unique path to graduate school. It was a great thing to do. But I was so amazingly prepared, right, by the previous experience, right, that it did, it's better to go to graduate school when you've got already got some preparation and kind of a direction, right?
And a passion, like you said.
Rather than not, if you just go because you don't know what you want to do, that's less good. So no, so that was an amazing experience,
and we still
and
pick your brain.
Yeah. Well, and it's find these topics still engaging me today. This whole flagellum thing has kind of come back up as a research focus. So yeah. So anyway, I really appreciate the chance to talk, and I'll get to see you in Tennessee in July. In the hot summer of Tennessee in July, and
breathing the same air.
Yeah, that'll be fantastic. So I'm looking forward to that.
Thank you, Nick. I really appreciate you doing this for us. It was great. And,
cool. Thanks so much. And other people listening, if you want to chat, just drop me an email. I'm always happy to chat about these things. Cool.
Very good. All right. Now, the rest of you, wait here a little bit longer. I need to tell you a couple of announcements. First, Skeptical is back. We will be holding I think it's the 11th, maybe the 12th. I should have counted this up. Skeptical conference in person this year at the Oakland Asian Cultural Center in downtown Oakland. We've met there several times before. Those of you who have attended Skeptical in person will remember this. This is a great site for it. Saturday, August 23. Mark your calendars. And keep an eye out on skepticalcon.org website, where you will find more information shortly on speakers and ticket prices and the rest. Now, next month's Skep Talk speaker will be skeptical YouTuber Coleman Watts, whose title is entitled Think This Through. Watts is a former conspiracy theorist, conspiracy theory enthusiast, I should say, who managed to climb out of the rabbit hole and kind of come over to the other side, as it were. And he's got a very engaging way of talking to both the people that he used to embrace, as well as helping to educate those of us who want to know more about, as he says, cons, cults, and conspiracies. He's got a background in theater. He uses humor, showmanship. Check out his website, check out his YouTube site sometime, but also check out his Skep Talk, which will be next month, Thursday, July 10 at 6:30, so an hour earlier. And thank you so much for coming to tonight's Skep Talk. See you next month.